Hi, I'm Aaron, the developer of EasyPop, and in this tutorial I'm going to be showing you the basics of EasyPop and how to set up pop-in in your Unity scene. So for this tutorial, I've made a simple example scene, and it's quite a bit smaller than what you would normally be using EasyPop for if you want to really be maximizing the performance benefit of EasyPop. But the goal here is just to show you how to actually set the system up. So you may notice that all the objects in the scene have been grouped into one of four parent objects. That's level geometry, and then objects in room A, objects in room B, and objects in room C. And this is really just for ease of use. It's absolutely not required, but it does make setup a little bit quicker, and it also helps keep the hierarchy clean, so I do recommend it. You also might notice that the objects within each room are of various different types. There are static objects, there are rigid bodies, there are lights, and you could have various other kinds of objects here, but I just wanted to kind of showcase the fact that EasyPop works with virtually any kind of Unity object. So the first thing I'm going to do is just drag and drop Unity's standard asset first-person character controller. The system works with any character controller that has a collider or a trigger attached to it. As long as it has that, it's supported. But in this case, we're just going to be using Unity's standard asset because it's nice and quick. The first thing we need to do with it, though, is we need to put it on its own layer. This needs to be a layer that's unique to the player that no other objects have. And the reason is that EasyPop uses layers to determine which objects are considered players and which ones aren't. And so any objects that are on the same layer as the player will be treated by EasyPop as players, meaning that areas that they're in will become activated. So to start actually setting up EasyPop, we're going to create an empty game object, and we're going to attach the epzone.cs component to it. So you now have your first pop-in zone, and there's three things that we're going to have to set up for that. The first thing is just that we're going to ensure that layers to check refers to the player's layer and only the player's layer. The second one is that we're going to designate the size and shape of the activation area of this zone. And how we do that is we expand the Shapes tab and click plus. So these shapes are determining what are essentially the collision area or the trigger area for the pop-in zone. If an object on the player layer is within one of these shapes, of which there can be as many as you want, then the area is considered active. So once the shapes are set up, the third and final step is just to assign the objects in this room to objects to activate. And that's really simple. You just click and drag your object or objects on top of objects to activate, and it adds it to the list. And this is where grouping the objects under a parent object really speeds things up, simply because you just don't have as many objects to click and drag. All right, so let's test it out real quick. You can see that when the player character is outside of the pop zone's shapes, the objects in the room all deactivate, and as soon as the player enters, the objects pop into existence. So now I'm going to make the pop zones for the other two rooms, and this is really an identical process. You create an empty game object, attach EP zone, and then just add some shapes and assign your objects to activate. Each zone operates independently, which means that there's no controller object and no linking between the different zones and so forth. They don't need to communicate with one another. All right, so now that all three rooms are set up, let's test it out. So everything is working correctly in the sense that the contents of the rooms are deactivating at the right times, but there is sort of that wonky, jumpy kind of effect when the contents of a room suddenly shows up. And that's pretty noticeable, and you would usually want to minimize this. So there's two solutions that I recommend around it, and you can actually use both. The first solution is simply to have larger shape areas. So you would just have the shapes of each zone kind of extend beyond the zone a little bit further so that they cover up the whole area that the player might be able to see the effect from. And this solution is good, but it does take a little bit of like trial and error and testing and so forth. The second solution is to use transitions. And transitions are something that's included with EasyPop. And the idea with the transition is you place some form of barrier in the entryway to a zone, and then the transition will smoothly either remove or in some other way hide the barrier to help hide the effect of pop-in. So for this tutorial, we're going to be using fade transitions, and the first thing you want to do to set up a fade transition is just to place the barriers themselves. So I recommend just creating a quad. It can be any mesh, but I think a quad is the most efficient. And remove the collider that comes pre-attached to it, because you want to be able to walk through it. And you're just going to place it in the doorway here, and you're going to put one in each doorway, and you're going to also duplicate each one and create one that's facing the opposite direction, right? So in each doorway, there are two barriers, one facing in each direction. Once the barriers are placed, select your pop zone and attach the EP transition fade component to it. And now all you need to do is drag and drop these barriers that you've set up, drag and drop the ones that are facing out of the room that you're currently messing with, and drag them onto renderers to fade. So now every time this area activates, it will make those particular renders fade out. And every time you leave the area and it deactivates, it will first fade those renders back in before deactivating the objects inside. And now you're just going to do the same thing for the other pop zones. And once they're all in, we can test it out. So now we can see that when we enter an area, the barriers for that area fade away gradually, and each time we exit the area, the barriers fade back in before the objects are actually deactivated. And that's about all there is to it. EasyPop does have some slightly more advanced features for particular use cases, and there are, of course, options to customize the appearance of the transitions. And all that stuff is covered in the manual, which is included with EasyPop. But for most use cases, what you've seen in this video is actually everything you need to know to get EasyPop running in your scene and speeding your game up.